Have you ever watched a national news debate spiral so far out of control that everyone watching felt something break inside of them and then realized that the story itself was far bigger than the TV moment? Before we go any further, let's go ahead and name the real players that are driving this entire controversy. So, Jessica Tarlov, the Fox News political analyst who found herself in the eye of a storm. Of course, you've got Greg Gutfeld, the Fox host who confronted her on live television. And Fox News, of course, the news network that's broadcasting the explosive exchange. Now, ICE, the U.S. Immigrations and Customs Enforcement Agency, at the very center of the shooting controversy. We've also got Renee Nicole Good, the 37-year-old woman that was killed in Minneapolis, Minnesota, by an ICE agent. And as of January 14th, 2026, Donald J. Trump is the sitting president of the United States, whose administration this enforcement action occurred under. Now, this is not about another talking head that's losing their cool. This is about a flashpoint where national outrage, federal enforcement, and media narratives collided. A Minneapolis shooting has triggered nationwide protests, legal battles, and a debate that blew up on screen with such force that Jessica Tarlov's reaction went viral overnight. Millions clicked, shared, shouted, and they argued. But you know, the burning question remains: is the outrage about what happened, or is it about what people think happened? Now, as we unpack every angle of this, the footage, the politics, the identities, the aftermath, you're going to see how one moment on Fox became a symbol of a much deeper American crisis. Be sure to hit the like button and subscribe. Okay, this didn't happen in a shouting match. That's the first thing that people get wrong. On Fox News, during a live panel discussion, Jessica Tarlov was doing what she normally does, framing the Minnesota ICE shooting almost entirely through emotion. But then Greg Gutfeld stepped in, and instead of raising his voice, he did something far more disruptive. He challenged the premise of the argument itself. Now, Gutfeld didn't argue whether the shooting felt bad. He asked why the enforcement action existed in the first place. Now, that shift drained the oxygen out of the room. I mean, you could hear it. The panel goes quiet. Jessica Tarlov pauses, and there's no follow-up pivot. There's no emotional reset. That silence right there. This is exactly what made that clip go viral. Viewers weren't watching a fight. They were basically watching someone lose narrative control in real time. That's why people didn't just react, they replayed it. And so, at the very center of this entire blowup is Renee Nicole Good, killed during an ICE operation in Minnesota. The uncontested facts, they matter here because they quietly dismantle the emotional framing. ICE agents were conducting a lawful enforcement action. Renee Good was inside of a vehicle. The vehicle moved. An officer perceived a threat. Shots were fired. Now, here's a reality that changed the entire Fox debate instantly. Prosecutors are signaling no charges. Not because the situation was clean, but because under existing use of force law, a moving vehicle can constitute deadly force. Now, that legal reality collapses the murder narrative, and it reframes the entire discussion as law versus activism, not left versus right. Once that became unavoidable, the Fox News panel wasn't debating opinions anymore. They were colliding with facts, and facts don't flinch. So this is where the exchange actually crossed the point of no return for Jessica Tarlov. Once Greg Gutfeld stopped engaging the emotion of the shooting and instead questioned the assumptions underneath it, Jessica Tarlov had nowhere to go. I mean, her entire argument depended on the audience accepting that ICE's presence itself was illegitimate. When that premise was challenged, every emotional appeal above it just collapsed. This is why her response stalled. It wasn't shock, it was exposure. She could not pivot to another moral claim because the foundation had cracked right underneath her. And this wasn't cruelty or grandstanding. This was just a live demonstration of what happens when narrative protection disappears. Viewers sensed it immediately. That uncomfortable pause, the recalibration that never quite lands. And once an audience sees that moment, they don't forget it. And this is why this clip didn't just trend, it stuck. People weren't cheering a takedown, they were recognizing a truth that they hadn't heard framed that way before. All right, let's go ahead and keep going, because this is where the debate on Fox News exposed something that was even bigger than a single argument. So here's the part that most people missed. See, Gutfeld wasn't defending a shooting. He was defending the idea that laws exist to be enforced. Now, under Donald J. Trump, immigration enforcement isn't symbolic. This is operational. And ICE doesn't show up randomly. It shows up because statutes are being executed. So Gutfeld's argument was simple and devastating. You don't get to enjoy a society built on rules while pretending that those rules suddenly become immoral when enforcement looks uncomfortable. And so once that's acknowledged, the debate changes entirely. Sympathy becomes secondary to accountability. Tragedy doesn't erase causality, and activism doesn't override the law. This is why the exchange felt so jarring on Fox News. The audience realized that the fight was never about feelings. It was about whether we're still willing to admit that a country without enforcement isn't compassion. It's just complete chaos. So this is where the story gets more uncomfortable. And this is also where crucial context was almost entirely absent from the original Fox exchange. So Minnesota Ice Watch isn't a loose collection of concerned neighbors. This is an organized network operating inside of Minnesota with training materials, communication channels, and coordinated plans designed specifically to monitor, interfere with, and disrupt ICE operations. Now, this really matters because it completely reframes Renee Good's presence that day. She wasn't randomly caught in some tragic moment. She was a part of an organized effort to insert civilians into an active federal enforcement action, period. And that doesn't make her disposable. It doesn't justify her death. But it does shatter the innocent observer narrative that dominated earlier coverage. And so once you introduce organized disruption into the equation, the risk calculus changes, and it really changes for everyone involved. And this is the context that never made it onto the Fox News panel. And it's also the context that explains why prosecutors are looking at this case very differently than activists want them to. So here's the emotional line that just could not survive contact with reality. The idea that Renee Nicole Good was simply a neutral legal observer. That's not true. That claim collapsed once details emerged about training, coordination, and intent. Observing means watching. Intervening means acting. And when a vehicle moves toward an officer during an active operation, the law doesn't care what label you apply after it. This is where the outrage narrative fractures. You can mourn Renee Good. You can believe her death was tragic. But you just can't honestly pretend that she was detached from the confrontation that led to it. Pretending that she had no agency doesn't honor her. It erases the truth. And that eraser is exactly what Greg Gutfeld was calling out when the Fox News panel went silent. So, as the story moved beyond cable news, another detail detonated activist narratives. The ICE agent involved in the shooting was identified not as some faceless enforcer, but as a real person with a documented background, military service, family, and prior experience in dangerous field operations. This really mattered because it directly undercut the caricature being sold on social media. This wasn't some rogue actor freelancing violence. This was a trained federal officer operating under ICE protocols during a lawful action tied to Renee Nicole Good's confrontation. Now, once that identity became public, the outrage machine shifted gears. Suddenly, the conversation wasn't just about sympathy. It was about intent, training, and even threat assessment. That is why this detail infuriated activists. It made the situation harder to flatten into some kind of a moral play. Facts don't chant, they don't trend well, but they quietly dismantle narratives that are built on abstraction. Now here's where the law, not politics, ends the argument. Under federal use of force standards, a moving vehicle can legally be treated as a deadly weapon. Now, that's not ideology. That is case law. Prosecutors reviewing the Minnesota incident are operating under those same standards, right alongside the DOJ posture under Donald J. Trump, which, by the way, has restored enforcement clarity rather than ambiguity. So when an officer reasonably perceives imminent harm, the law does not require perfect judgment, only reasonable judgment in real time. So this is why insiders are signaling no charges, not because the death wasn't tragic, but because tragedy alone does not establish criminal liability. Now, this legal reset This is exactly what froze the Fox panel earlier, because once the law enters the room, emotional framing loses authority. This is the part that few viewers had heard clearly before this moment. So what happened on Fox News wasn't an accident. It was inevitable. Now, for years, media conversations around immigration enforcement avoided the hard edges, the law, the risks, the consequences, and lived almost entirely in moral abstraction. Now, sure, that works until a real-world case refuses to cooperate, right? But the Renee Nicole Good shooting forced facts back into a conversation that was built on feelings. And when those facts surfaced, the panel fractured. So this is why the exchange between Greg Gutfeld and Jessica Tarlov felt so jarring. One side was still arguing intent and emotion, but the other had moved on to causality and law. So this mismatch always creates combustion. Audiences aren't tired of compassion. They're tired of being asked to suspend reality. When the gap gets too wide, something snaps on live TV. That snap went viral. Then came Hollywood. Actors and celebrities, including Mark Ruffalo, publicly aligned themselves with this activist narrative, using awards season platforms like the Golden Globes to signal solidarity. Pins were worn, statements were made, but none of it addressed the legal facts that are now driving this case. Now, that contrast matters. Celebrity outrage operates in a world where symbolism substitutes for accountability. Courtrooms don't work that way. They just don't. Prosecutors don't weigh hashtags. Judges don't consider applause lines. When celebrities spoke as if charges were inevitable, they revealed how disconnected cultural commentary has actually become from legal reality. This wasn't influencing the outcome at all. It was simply reacting to it too late. And so this is why the Fox moment hit so hard. Viewers weren't just watching a panel fight, they were watching two Americas collide, one governed by emotion and performance, and the other by law and consequence. Now, what really surprised many people was that validation didn't come from the right. It actually came from the left. Bill Maher, hardly a defender of immigration enforcement, openly criticized Hollywood's performative outrage surrounding the Renee Nicole Good case. Now, Bill Maher didn't defend ICE. He didn't praise ICE law enforcement. But what he did was he rejected the ritual, the pins, the slogans, the moral theater detached from facts. Now, that really mattered because it stripped the moment of partisan cover. When even a liberal critic says symbolic activism doesn't substitute for reality, this confirms what Greg Gutfeld was arguing on Fox. This wasn't about compassion versus cruelty. It was about honesty versus posturing. Now, Bill Maher's refusal to play along reinforced this idea that the outrage machine had outrun the facts. And once credibility cracks from within your own ideological camp, the argument loses its shield. That's when viewers start reassessing what they thought that they knew. This wasn't just a Fox News clip. It was a pressure release. Now, across the country, people watched the debate finally collide with reality. Not slogans, not abstractions, but law, consequence, and accountability. The reason the Jessica Tarlov-Greg Gutfeld exchange exploded wasn't because someone won. It was because premise denial was exposed live, and millions recognized it instantly. Now, under Donald J. Trump's presidency, enforcement is no longer theoretical, it's operational. And that shift forced a reckoning that the media delayed for too long. Americans aren't rejecting empathy. They're rejecting being told that empathy requires ignoring the facts. And so this is why this moment spread beyond politics. It felt like clarity cutting through the noise. There was no shouting, no walking off needed, just a quiet realization on live television that some arguments only survive when their foundations are never questioned. That's what broke. And that's why this moment will be remembered long after the clip stops circulating.